Where do horror movies get their monsters? Have you ever wondered why so many horror villains feel strangely familiar, like you've heard the story before? That's because most of them weren't invented by Hollywood. They come from folklore. The myths, legends, and cultural fears of the past didn't stay in the past. They evolved, adapted, and eventually walked right onto the movie screen. From witches in the woods to vampires and ghosts, horror movies are modern-day folklore, keeping the old fears alive in new forms. So let's take a look at some of the most iconic horror films and trace them back to their roots in folklore. Part 1. Witches and Folk Horror. Let's start with witches, because they might be the oldest horror figure of them all. Take Robert Eggers' The Witch from 2015. On the surface, it's about a Puritan family in New England who are torn apart by paranoia and supernatural forces. But what it's really doing is channeling the folklore of the 1600s. The early colonists brought with them centuries of European witch lore, tales of modern women who lived on the edges of society, who supposedly made pacts with the devil, stole children, and cursed crops. These weren't just spooky stories, they were cultural warnings, a way of reinforcing religious order and punishing outsiders. When you watch The Witch, you're basically watching a folklore tale play out. The goat, Black Phillip, is right out of those legends of witches consorting with demons. Even the family's isolation in the woods reflects the folklore fear that evil lurked beyond the safety of the village. And it's not just a witch. The Blair Witch Project tapped into the same ideas, inventing a fictional local legend but grounding it in the way real folklore works. Stories told around the fire and urban legends that spread until nobody remembers where they came from. Folk horror works because it makes you feel like you're watching the kind of stories your ancestors truly believed in. Part 2. Vampires and the Undead. Now let's move to another legend that never dies, the vampire. Vampires have been with us for centuries, long before Dracula or Nosferatu. In Eastern European folklore, people told stories of the Strigoi and Nosferatu, the dead who returned to feed on the living. These weren't elegant romantic figures, they were corpses, pale and bloated, spreading disease and terror. That folklore was rooted in real fears. When plague swept through villages, when people died mysteriously in their sleep, vampires became the explanation. In some places, bodies were even dug up and staked through the heart because villagers believed the dead were rising. Cinema turned those grim folktales into icons. Nosferatu in 1922 is basically a folklore vampire on screen, rat-like, grotesque, a walking plague. Then came Dracula, turning the myth into something more aristocratic and seductive. And since then, every generation has reinvented the vampire to reflect its own fears, from the lonely, monstrous vampire in 30 Days of Night to the glamorous immortals in Interview with the Vampire. The vampire works because it's adaptable, but at its heart, it's still folklore, the fear of the dead refusing to stay dead. If you're enjoying this breakdown of folklore and horror, don't forget to subscribe to the Folklore Fauna for more myths, cryptids, and legends brought to life. Now, let's get back to the story. Part 3. Werewolves and Shapeshifters. If vampires represent death, then werewolves represent the beast within. In European folklore, the werewolf was a cursed man doomed to transform under the full moon, slaughtering animals and even people. These stories were warnings. Don't wander outside at night. Don't stray too far from the safety of the village. But they also reflected deep fears about human nature, about what happens when the civilized mask slips. Movies like An American Werewolf in London tapped into that folklore perfectly. The curse, the transformation, the loss of control. It's not just a monster story, it's about identity and the horror of becoming something you can't stop. But shapeshifter myths aren't just European. In Mexico, the Nahual is said to be a sorcerer who could take animal form, usually a wolf or coyote. In Navajo tradition, the skinwalker is a dark figure with the power to wear animal skins and transform. These legends, though culturally different, echo the same fear, the idea that humans can cross the line into something unnatural. That's why werewolf stories still work in horror. They take old folklore and make it personal, turning the monster into us. Part 4, Ghosts and Spirits. Now let's talk about ghosts because almost every culture has them. Japanese folklore is full of onryo, vengeful spirits of women who died unjustly, usually with long disheveled hair covering their faces. This imagery is exactly what made Ringu and its American remake, The Ring, so terrifying. Sadako climbing out of the TV wasn't just a creepy effect, it was folklore visualized perfectly for modern audiences. In the West, ghosts usually show up in haunted houses or graveyards. The Conjuring series and Paranormal Activity play into older European American ghost lore, where restless spirits remain tied to a place. These films succeed because they use folklore that already feels believable. Almost everyone has heard a ghost story, and horror movies just amplify that fear. The cultural differences are fascinating. In Japan, the ghost is often about personal vengeance, righting a wrong. In the West, the ghost is a restless soul, unfinished business. But either way, the folklore translates directly into the movies we watch today. Part 5, Monsters from Folklore. Of course, not all horror monsters fit neatly into one category. Some films pull directly from ancient myth. The Ritual from 2017 is a great example. A group of friends lost in the Scandinavian wilderness find themselves hunted by a creature straight out of Norse mythology. It's not just a monster, it's tied to ancient gods and pagan worship, folklore made flesh. Then there's Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. While not pure horror, it borrows from European fairy lore and the darker side of Fey mythology. The faun, the pale man, these creatures feel like something out of a centuries-old storybook, not just fantasy. Even modern creations like the Babadook come from folklore archetypes. The Babadook itself may be new, but it's really just a boogeyman, a universal figure found in almost every culture. Parents once used the boogeyman to scare children into behaving. Now it scares adults too. Folklore doesn't need to be copied exactly for it to inspire horror. Sometimes just borrowing the framework, the idea of an old story whispered from generation to generation, is enough to make a new monster feel ancient. Part 6, Regional Legends turned horror. Finally, let's look at the movies that draw straight from regional legends. In Latin America, the story of La Llorona, the weeping woman who has drowned her children and now wanders searching for them, is one of the most famous. It's been adapted into several films, from local productions to Hollywood's The Curse of La Llorona. The story endures because it's part ghost tale, part cautionary legend. In the U.S., Candyman was built around the framework of urban legends, especially the Bloody Mary mirror ritual. It blended folklore with modern fears, turning a local legend into a terrifying supernatural slasher. And then there are stories like Skinwalker Ranch, where Navajo folklore meets modern UFO and cryptid lore. Whether you believe it or not, the reason it has staying power is because it feels rooted in something older, something sacred and terrifying. Conclusion. So why do horror movies work so well when they lean on folklore? Because folklore is already designed to scare us. These are stories that have survived centuries, whispered around campfires, told children to keep them in line, or passed down as warnings about the unknown. Horror cinema is just the latest chapter in that storytelling tradition. Witches, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, they never really gone away. They just changed costumes, adapting to each new generation's fears. When you watch a horror movie, you're not just seeing a scary story, you're seeing the survival of folklore alive and well in the age of cinema. Because the old myths never die, they just get retold on screen. And that's the end of today's dive into folklore behind horror movies. These legends have been haunting humanity for centuries, and they're not going anywhere. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe to the Folklore Fauna for more deep dives into cryptids, myths, and the creatures that lurk in our collective imagination. What folklore-based horror movie is your favorite? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe even cover it in a future video. Thanks for watching, and remember, the stories we tell about monsters are often more about us than the monsters themselves. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit. You never know what might be waiting in the dark.